After being attacked by mosquitoes in the aching dawn, when Pentaquad surveyed his lumpy arms and felt the sting spots on his face, he wondered if he could remain in such a place. But on subsequent nights, he discovered that if he kept a small smudge fire going and closed all the openings of his wigwam and smeared his face with rancid fish grease and hid every inch of his body beneath cloth or grass, he could survive the mosquitoes. It wasn't pleasant, and he sweated like an animal, but he did survive, and it occurred to him that when the Great Spirit, the Great Power, Manitou, finished laying down this river, perfect in all details, the Great Spirit had added the mosquito to remind human beings that no paradise comes free. There are always mosquitoes, and bigger ones than these could not exist. During the day, Pentaquad fished and hunted and noted where the beaver were and also the bear. And he tentatively probed and explored inland, seeking any signs of human occupation. But he didn't find any. Fishing longlegs came to visit him almost daily, and little green herons and brilliant cardinals and kingfishers came to visit from their muddy nest, and hundreds of quail making the autumn afternoons ring with their whistling cries. This was a much more compact world than either the island or the cliff. Its horizon was limited to the distance a stone could be tossed. But it was snug and secure, and one afternoon Pentaquad decided, if I must live alone, this won't be so bad, especially when cold drives away the mosquitoes. And then one morning, while he was still abed on his mattress, his pallets of pine needles, he heard a wild noise, a wild cacophony, a rumble which seemed to move the earth, yet came from the sky. And he rushed out to see, descending toward his marsh, a cloud of huge birds, all of them crying in loud voices, "Onk! Onk!" And in that first moment of seeing the geese, he understood and comprehended them totally. Jet black head and neck, snow white under chin, beautiful cream body with brown top, black tail, raucous, noisy, lovable, fat, and constantly shouting to each other. "Honker!" He had hoped that these powerful birds would land on his waters, but they flew past, arguing loudly. And then more came, and more, and more. And they were so numerous, he didn't even have a system of numbers to count them. There were so many. But finally, one especially noisy group of about 70 wheeled in the air, flew low over his head, and landed with a noisy, riotous splashing in his marsh, or with grinding feet upon his land. Close at hand, they seemed too big to be called birds. They were more like flying bear cubs loaded with edible meat. The arrival of this bountiful food was so mysterious that Pentaquad became afraid. As a boy, he had watched when ducks stopped by the Susquehannock. They stayed only for a few days before flying on, and he assumed that these huge creatures would do the same. Each morning he expected them to leave, and each night they remained, foraging in the fields and marshes along the river, always crying, "Onk!" Every 8 or 9 days, he trapped one of the geese, and he gorged himself on the tasty meat, afraid that this might be his last feast. But always the great birds stayed. They were with him through the autumn. On some days, when they flew off at dawn to feed on new fields, their wings would darken the sky, and their honking cries would deafen. Once at the edge of the marsh, Pentaquad tried to estimate how thick the cloud was as the birds flew overhead, and he supposed that at each spot as many as 300 geese were flying, one above the other, until the sun could not be seen. In the afternoon, when the birds returned, they would congregate on the north bank of the river, so that the sun, moving through the southern sky, could warm them, and the muddy banks would be black with birds from the shoreline to where the trees started. Again, Pentaquad tried to count how many rows of birds lined the shore at a given spot. Starting at the water's edge, there would be more than 50, one after the other, reaching back to the first trees. This was a richness he could not comprehend. These great noisy birds were infinite. At first he thought that he should kill several and smoke their meat and feed off them through the winter. But what if the birds stayed on, standing there on the shore in endless rows, waiting to be taken? There would be no need to smoke and conserve for winter. One would simply catch them, one after another, whenever he needed them. And the birds did stay, as rich a food resource as the great bay provided. For along with the larger birds came a huge amount, a bewildering variety of smaller ducks, of the kind that Pentaquad had seen once or twice in few numbers and sparing numbers along his native river. Here the ducks came in waves, shy, small creatures, unbelievably tasty when caught and cooked. Once, when many big and little birds settled along the edges of his marsh, Pentaquad sat with his hands over his face in prayer. The birds, preparing for sleep, were making a violent chatter, and he listened to the noise as if it had been sweet music. Great power and great spirit, thank you for sending them to feed us through the winter. And as soon as he had uttered the word us, he realized how lonely he was and how bereft and sad. The next morning he determined to quit this haven, this safe place amongst the marshes, and find the people who had to be living somewhere along this wonderful, fortunate river. He had paddled only a short distance to the east when he spied a small bay opening into the northern shore. It looked as if it might hide a village, though how one could have existed so close at hand without his noticing was confusing. And when he explored and probed into the bay, he saw that it opened into several smaller arms, and at the head of one of these arms of water he found what he had been seeking, the remnants of a village. Pilings, logs, had been driven into the shore, and to them canoes had once been attached. There were also platforms on which oval wigwams of some size had once stood. The foreshore had been cleared, as well as 2 fields in back, and he explored the area carefully, gingerly, without getting out of his canoe. He found that all along the edges of the bay were other signs of occupation and of human people. Returning to the larger site, he beached his canoe, tied it to one of the pilings, and walked ashore. He stayed for many days, gratified and thankful to see the large, noisy geese came to the bay at night. And in this time he was able to explore enough of the countryside east of the abandoned town to know that he had come at last upon the occupied portion of the river. Where the people were now, though, he could not say, but all signs indicated and showed that they must have been there recently and had moved away of their own choice, of their own volition. There was no sign, no indication of battle, and with the food available, there could have been no cause for starvation. Indeed, as he stood on the remnants and remains of the village, he could not know that even though he had already discovered the deer and the abundant fish, and now the large birds, he had failed to find the two sources of food supply for which this region would be famous. The apparent abandonment of the area by people was more perplexing and puzzling, and that when Pentecoit inspected the area closely, he became convinced of its suitability for living. It had fresh water, protection, a convenient relationship with the river, many tall trees, and a hinterland suitable for either hunting or the cultivation and growing of corn. There was, however, one strange and ominous feature he could not explain, and in the end he reasoned that this might be the reason, the sinister force which had caused the people to leave and evacuate. But what was it? It was a pile, large at the base and almost as high as a man's head, of a kind of shell he had not seen before. It was somewhat smaller than a hand and much thinner. It was composed of a hard gray substance on the outside and a shimmering white on the inside. It had no smell. It was fairly solid, a solidity that mystified him, and the shells had one sharp edge. This led him to believe that maybe this pile had been assembled for use in war. The individual shells might have been thrown at the enemy. But when he tried hurling one of these shells at a tree, the edges were so sharp he cut his forefinger and concluded and decided that the pile was merely one more mystery of the new river. And then one afternoon, as he sat idly, quiet in the deserted village, he heard a subdued but persistent noise coming from the east. And at first he thought it must be some kind of animal, but it was so varied and purposeful that he knew it had to be people. Maybe a war party, victorious and inattentive and not quiet at all. But then the noise grew much louder, with the sounds that could be made only by children. And he muttered, it can't be a whole village making such noises as it approaches a dangerous spot. for a band of Susquehannocks moving through the forest would have made so little sound that even the most attentive enemy's scouts would not hear them. Noisy behavior like this was unbelievable. He was so puzzled and bewildered that he moved out to intercept the strangers, darting carefully from one tree to the next as he had been taught by his tribe. When he was safely located, so he could watch both the forest and the river, he waited while the approaching noises increased. And then he saw a sight which was even stranger than the sound. Down the trail, ignoring possible danger, came the happy, carefree population of the empty village. Women straggled along, and children shouted noisily and raucously, and all were led by a white-haired old man wearing upon his chest a disc of polished copper, signifying that he was the Werowance, the chief.